The Taliban have declared a national holiday in Afghanistan to mark 1 year since they seized power. The anniversary is being marked against the backdrop of a worsening humanitarian crisis and continuing concerns about the rights of women and girls. It's reported that in the past year, the Taliban has used punishments, including public flogging, to maintain order.
Hundreds of Taliban fighters gathered in the Afghan capital of Kabul to celebrate the first anniversary of their takeover of the country. In the southern city of Kandahar, where Taliban leadership is based, armed fighters and their supporters paraded on the central road in vehicles captured from the previous Afghan government. The Taliban see this as a celebration of their victory in their struggle against the US-led international presence in Afghanistan, as well as their influence in government. Taliban rule has not been without its challenges, as Afghanistan grapples with rising poverty, drought and malnutrition. An estimated 25 million Afghans are living in poverty. The Afghan economy has come under immense strain following the country's isolation by the international community. Humanitarian aid, which the country was heavily dependent on, was also cut as global powers called for the Taliban to recognize and respect the human rights of citizens. Women and girls in particular have seen their rights eroded and have for the last year been unable to access secondary or tertiary education. Security in the country, however, has greatly improved since the US troop withdrawal and the overthrow of the democratic government. Despite this stability, many people, even in more conservative regions of the country, are deeply despondent about the future and worried about the trajectory that the country is going on.
Well, for some analysis, we're now joined by the Executive Director of the Afro-Middle-East Centre Naeem Jeenah. Naeem, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Good to talk to you again.
Thank you, Peter. Always good to talk to you.
When we talk about Afghanistan and the Taliban, there are a number of perspectives, but let's just look at the country itself. A year later, where it was and where it's now, what's your assessment?
Well, it's a country in crisis. It's a nation in crisis right now. And the main crisis, of course, is the economic and humanitarian one, both of them linked, of course. As the intro pointed out, you have a situation where the Afghan state is owed $7 billion, or between $7 and $9 billion by Western countries that have been frozen, and so they are unable to make use of that. But more importantly, you have a situation where around 40% of the population doesn't have enough money to buy food. Another 33 odd percent is able to buy food but nothing else, no money for anything else. More than half the population is malnourished. A larger percentage of children are malnourished. So you have a really dire situation both in the cities as well as, and more especially, in the countryside in Afghanistan. And there doesn't seem to be any sign that situation is going to improve. Certainly there's no sign that humanitarian aid will resume as it had been before a year ago, nor that $7 billion that has been frozen will be unfrozen. I mean, the US today made it clear that it will not be unfrozen. So as to what the future might hold for Afghans, it's a very difficult one.
All right, so a number of things that you pointed to are by and large not of their own making. What has been of their own making, do you think?
Well, part of it, of course, and part of what makes the Afghan people despondent, more anxious, and with less hope for the future includes, for example, again in your intro, the Taliban going back on the guarantees they had given about things like women's education. High schools have been closed in many places, not all, but in many places high schools have been closed. Women have been excluded from jobs that they had held before a year ago. So the whole situation around women and women's access to work and women's access to education has been severely curtailed. And as a result, also women's role in public life generally, including the necessity now imposed by the Taliban for for women to veil before going out. So that has been part of their own making, of course. And that also means that you have a situation where you have a government where a large part of the population doesn't see an ownership of that government, despite, again, as the intro pointed out, that between a year ago and now, the security situation in the country has improved greatly. Even though ISIS continues to operate, and the Taliban has tried to bring that under control, but not entirely successfully. Nevertheless, the security situation has improved. But how much of a benefit is that when, for example, women are not allowed to be educated, and you have the humanitarian crisis that you do?
What does Afghanistan need to do to be re-embraced by the international community? Are there some non-negotiables that the West have that they just can't accede to?
Well, I think with the funds, Afghan funds that have been frozen, it hasn't been made clear what those conditions might be. But certainly, in terms of some of the aid, some of the European countries, for example, stopped the aid after it was clear that the Taliban went back on their guarantee about women's education. So I think that the guarantees that the Taliban gave a year and a half or so ago, in terms of how they would run the state, those need to be put into place. So one is about the kind of position of women in Afghanistan, education, work, etc., women and girls in particular. Secondly, that there was also the understanding that was given that they would form a kind of national unity government. Up to now, all of the positions in government, and we're talking about 1 year later, not a month later, 1 year later, all of the positions in government are held by Taliban people. So these are, I think, two of the big issues that the Taliban should and can address quite easily in order to allay some of the concerns of the international community and allow humanitarian funds to come in, sanctions to be lifted, etc. The sanctions have been quite crippling. Even Human Rights Watch has said that even without these reforms that I'm mentioning now, sanctions should be eased. But with these kinds of, and it's not reforms, it's promises that the Taliban had made that they just didn't put into practice. If they did now, it will help to at least allow the flow of humanitarian aid in and somehow stem the crisis that is taking place in terms of the malnutrition and poverty disaster.
This time a year ago, we were having conversations about the Taliban not ready to rule, and that in fact they were given power probably a lot quicker than they thought it was going to happen. Do you think a year later they've learned to govern? Apart from these human rights questions, have they learned the business of government, or is that still a work in progress?
Well, of course, a year ago they were not given power; they took power, and the former corrupt government just kind of dissolved itself or went into exile with good reason, because they had made a mess of the country already. But a year later, no. Apart from the concerns that I've mentioned, I don't believe that the Taliban government is in a position or has the capacity to govern, to run a complex economy, and to govern in a way that they can continue to maintain support of the people. A year ago, we saw those scenes of people trying to escape Afghanistan. I think if in the past year the Taliban had made things easier for its population and included people into its decision-making processes, even some of those people might have returned. And certainly the people that are in the country, if the humanitarian aid was there, if the economy was improving, etc., people in the country would be more enthusiastic about their future and the future of the country. So a year later, no, I don't think that they are in a position where they are able to do it or that they are doing it.
What about its international face? I mean, it is a state now, and there's a government in place. How are relations with neighboring states?
Well, most countries are still a bit tentative, and I think that this is part of the problem, that the Taliban, after a couple of years of negotiations with the United States in Qatar, they believed that once they took over, they would get the kind of international recognition that, in a sense, they expected after the negotiations. That has not been forthcoming. One or two neighboring states, or few neighboring states, have recognized them. Others haven't fully recognized them, but are dealing with them, such as China. But in general, that recognition has not come. And I think that with such recognition would also go the kind of pressure that would ensure that the Taliban was able to, or to ensure that the Taliban stuck to the promises it made. Without that, the international community does not have that leverage. So the United States, a year ago when they pulled out, left the country in a huge mess. I mean, the humanitarian situation didn't start after the Taliban took over. It was there already before that. And the Taliban took over a situation which they could not improve or improve on. And the security situation was very bad, etc. But they have not been able to rein that in. They have not been able to fix that in the past year.
Naeem, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. Thanks for your insights.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. That's Naeem Jeenah, Executive Director at the Afro-Middle-East Centre, joining us to talk about Afghanistan a year on. The Taliban took control a year ago, and the story really has been of a deteriorating economic situation, a humanitarian crisis, and a shrinking of some human rights for particularly women and girls.